Okay, so as I said, we really, did the lion's share by far of the mind wandering lecture. I wanted to kind of just round out some of the stuff we had talked about. We really talked about, in particular, a few studies looking at using ERPs and fMRI to try to sort of validate self-reports, to get some converging objective evidence that the mental state, the brain state of these individuals who are self-reporting mind wandering is actually different than when they're self-reporting being on task, which goes some way towards validating them. We're not just taking them on their word or their subjective kind of interpretation. So there are other kinds of imaging and non-imaging techniques alike that we can apply towards successfully studying mind wandering in a scientific way. So TMS, right? We've talked about TMS a fair bit already. We're actually going to talk about, as cool as it is for making causal inferences, which is one of the things you see it used for throughout our course. When we get into the consciousness stuff later today, we'll look at a way to use TMS that helps you assess connectivity. But in the sort of more traditional, straightforward use, a number of publications have come out with people at least claiming to increase or decrease mind wandering by upregulating or downregulating certain regions. So we talked about sort of the obvious, this isn't necessarily exactly what they do, but kind of the obvious general hypothesis would be, well, if the default mode network becomes active when you're mind wandering, maybe activating that or increasing the activation of that network with TMS might lead to increased mind wandering reports. And we do indeed, in some publications, see that. There's some debate about exactly what's happening. One kind of methodological alternative explanation is just because you zap someone and they start reporting mind wandering more, doesn't mean they actually are mind wandering more. They might, for example, just have gained better meta awareness. Maybe the part of the brain you're targeting is involved with monitoring behavior. So that aside, there are a number of kind of promising approaches to manipulating mind wandering directly, which, if you'll remember from our last discussion about mind wandering, one of the big methodological challenges was related to the fact that you don't have control over the stimuli. You can't control someone's mind wandering in the same way that you can present stimuli in a very controlled way in experimental setups. So eye tracking, of course, isn't considered imaging, but you can glean a lot of useful information about what people are doing and how their behavior changes when they're mind wandering by, for example, seeing how reading behavior changes. You can also use eye tracking, as some of you probably know, to measure pupil dilation. So that's a nice kind of physiological measure that you can get as sort of a bonus with eye trackers. Now, we haven't talked about near infrared spectroscopy in our course, and there isn't a lot of work using it, but it's something that it's kind of billed as like a low-cost, non-invasive fMRI, because in theory, you can look at changes in essentially the bold level. You can look at changes in oxygenation of blood, which is going to be correlated with activation of neural tissue. So you can use, people have published studies going as far back as 5 years, looking at measuring changes in default mode activation using this technology. Another kind of popular approach that I think has a lot of merit is looking at mind wandering in various kind of ecologically valid contexts. For those of you that remember the mind wandering lecture, you may remember talking about the START task, this incredibly boring, presumably very low in ecological validity task. It's cool to use that to study mind wandering, and there are some good reasons to use it, as we discussed. But it's also the case that probably we want to know what happens with mind wandering in more relevant contexts, things people actually do in real life, like what effect does mind wandering actually have when you're sitting in a lecture. It's not a given that it will only hurt your comprehension. It might actually solidify certain memories or certain representations by allowing you to build connections you wouldn't have otherwise made, which is very important for memory. Another kind of popular approach is to look at how mind wandering affects driving, right? The whole distracted driving thing dovetails nicely with questions about cell phone use while driving, more general distracted driving questions. So to sort of round out this discussion, as I said in the preamble back in our Zoom window, I'm not really going to go into detail with boredom other than to kind of make you aware that it is a topic that people study, like mind wandering. You may have heard me or someone else talk about mind wandering in another class, but otherwise you might have been surprised to learn that scientists are actually researching it. Boredom might fit a certain kind of niche, or might fit a similar kind of niche where you don't really think of it as being a topic that lends itself to scientific inquiry. In fact, it's probably very closely related to mind wandering. Of course, you probably will not be surprised to hear that when people get bored, they tend to mind wander more. But boredom is also, in many ways, a distinct construct that has its own kind of characteristics and properties. Not only do we see that when we do sort of fancy statistical modeling, we see that it seems to be distinct from other things that we might think of as being similar, like apathy, a lack of caring, anhedonia, a lack of the ability to experience pleasure, which often accompanies depression. Depression itself, of course, is somewhat distinct from those other constructs. And so one of the sort of things we can note about boredom is, like mind wandering and like a whole lot of other stuff we've talked about in this class, it is frequently found to be sort of boredom like behavior, or reports of boredom or measurements of boredom seem to be elevated in certain kinds of clinical populations. So something like a population who has ADD or ADHD might report getting bored more easily, and that might have consequences for how they shift their attention, when they shift their attention, et cetera, et cetera. But we also see populations with traumatic brain injuries who have a lot of issues with boredom. So Dankert is a researcher who is at the University of Waterloo, and he's done a lot of work on boredom. His part of his backstory for being interested in boredom is his brother was in a car accident and sort of largely recovered, but had this lingering problem with boredom, things he enjoyed before he just couldn't get into, he couldn't get engaged with. So as often happens with people, um, having a bit of a personal connection to these things tends to kind of spark a bit of curiosity. And we see that across lots of case studies of individuals with traumatic brain injuries in various regions of the brain, we see that they have these kinds of issues with boredom. And I think we think of boredom as being kind of a trivial thing when it happens in moderate amounts. It's maybe not that big of a deal, but if you're chronically bored, if you chronically have trouble engaging with things and getting excited about things, getting interested in things, again, you can see how constructs like apathy, anhedonia, and depression are related. Mind wandering is probably related, but nevertheless distinct. So it's important to kind of delineate these and understand how they overlap, how they relate, how they interact, but also how things like the underlying neurology might differ. One of the ideas that has been applied towards both mind wandering and also boredom is that, as we talked about in the mind wandering literature, mind wandering in part at times is explained as a failure of executive control. You're trying to focus on something and you can't. And we talked about how intentionality probably factors in. And we looked at some imaging data to kind of corroborate that we don't always mind wander because we fail at paying attention to something. Sometimes we choose to mind wander. So probably boredom is not, strictly speaking, a failure of executive control, but it may in many instances, perhaps particularly in these TBI case studies where the frontal lobe is damaged, it may, at least in part, involve difficulty engaging with material that you've kind of explicitly defined as something that you're trying to focus on. And then just to leave you with kind of a thought about the potential heterogeneity of boredom, just like mind wandering is not necessarily any one thing, just like intentional and unintentional mind wandering might be relatively different processes and or behaviors, might have different underlying neurology. There may be different kinds of boredom that also have different kinds of associated consequences. So sort of really generally speaking, one distinction that some researchers have advocated for is this distinction between apathetic boredom and agitated boredom. And The difference is essentially how motivated you are to seek out stimulation. So if you, or specifically stimulation in your immediate environment. So you could imagine someone who is apathetically bored, who's just sitting around somewhere and isn't engaged with anything, isn't interested in anything, but doesn't really care, is sort of content just to sit there and zone out. And you can think about how mind wandering episodes sometimes have that characteristic where you're really not thinking about anything in particular. Whereas at other times, you can have really rich kind of daydream like experiences that are quite different than that zoning out feeling, but could nevertheless still be considered mind wandering. So similar with boredom, we can have a more kind of vacant state where we're sort of just unoccupied. Our mind is not connecting with anything. But we can also have a more sort of motivated bored state, if I could put it that way, to paraphrase the agitated boredom label, where you're actually, you're not feeling engaged with anything, but you're looking for something in the environment to focus on. Maybe you're even just going to pick something up and start fidgeting with it, but there's this kind of drive to engage with something, rather than, again, the other kind of boredom that is sort of described by these researchers, this apathetic kind of boredom. Okay, so that is mind wandering and boredom. So we are now going to get into consciousness, which in many ways I think is a nice kind of follow-up to what we were just talking about. We could think a little bit about how mind wandering and boredom might intersect with consciousness. So to begin with, it should be noted, maybe this goes without saying, but consciousness is a very difficult topic to study scientifically. I made the comment earlier that a lot of the later chapters in this Possel textbook kind of tackle what you might think of as more and more kind of abstract concepts, right? When we start getting to things like language or social behavior, it's a little bit less obvious what we're going to measure, how to study that scientifically, as compared to something like how we would study working memory scientifically, or object recognition. So we're building out into potentially more and more kind of unwieldy concepts. But sort of going hand in hand with that, I think we could argue the potential for the richness associated with these concepts is increasing. So the idea that we have brains that can think about themselves and how they're wired up and how they're communicating with themselves is both kind of like a meta, sort of something that you stumble over in a meta way. It seems hard to get your head around. It seems quite profound. But there are all of these kind of questions we can ask about consciousness that researchers and philosophers alike for centuries and millennia have been trying to understand. There's a very rich tradition, a very kind of storied tradition of philosophers trying to understand what the conscious experience is and how we can understand it. So of course, I'm not going to just sit back and screen share a video with you guys. I'll invite you to watch this on your own time. As usual, I'm not going to test you directly from any of these videos I'm linking to, but Chalmers is someone who has, among other things, thought about this from a bit of a philosophical perspective. So he has a TED Talk that is not a bad little rundown if you're interested in kind of the more abstract, sort of profound, what I would describe as kind of, more sort of almost metaphysical aspects of this. But he's also quite interested in a very grounded way, looking at this in a scientific way. And he kind of compares and contrasts a few different kinds of ways that modern researchers and philosophers and scientists have been thinking about consciousness. So we're going to really just focus exclusively on understanding consciousness from the perspective of what's happening physiologically this lecture. And then for our final lecture on Thursday, we are going to talk a little bit about approaching it from these other two perspectives, from a content-based perspective. So rather than looking at, for example, what's happening specifically in the brain when you are conscious or not conscious, or when your state of consciousness changes, we can also play around with things like subliminal presentation or near subliminal presentation of stimuli, where we can look at sort of what's the line between, if I present a picture really, really quickly on the monitor, what's the line between maybe us being able to observe measurable changes in your behavior as a result of that presentation, something like priming, yet it may be at a presentation duration that is so brief you don't have conscious awareness of seeing it. How does that compare with if you present something for longer so someone can gain conscious awareness of it? That's sort of more of a content-based approach. The theoretical approach is going to kind of try to tie together some of the findings and sort of points of agreement we see in these first two approaches, the physiological and content-based, and going to try to kind of make some connections and make some claims about how we might at least hypothesize theoretically that consciousness might sort of quote unquote work. So for our class today, we are going to, towards the end of the lecture, or I should really say maybe just the second half, we're going to think a little bit about how sleep, anesthesia both could induce what we would consider altered states of consciousness. And remember, we're looking at this from the physiological perspective today. So we're trying to understand largely how physiological changes that we can observe that accompany these kind of changes, like when you fall asleep or cycle through different stages of sleep, how those correlate with different kinds of, for example, subjective experiences while in those states, or other kinds of more objective measures of awareness that we can correlate with changes in the physiology in those kinds of states. Particularly relevant for what I just mentioned, we're also going to look at some clinical examples of altered states of consciousness, more sort of extreme examples. So we're going to actually start by talking about comas. And so coma, some people may define these things a little bit differently, but we're going to talk about coma, a vegetative state, and unresponsiveness wakefulness syndrome, or UWS for short. We're going to talk about those three things as being kind of synonymous or interchangeable. There's been some attempt to kind of move away from using the term vegetative state because it has a connotation that a lot of people don't like, which I think is understandable. So a lot of the kind of literature that was published before this sort of shift in the terminology happened will still refer to vegetative states. A lot of the more recent literature will refer to unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, UWS. And both of those things are getting at what you might sort of more colloquially refer to simply as a coma. We're going to talk about that kind of experience first and what sort of physiological changes we can correlate with people who are in that state or those states. And then we're also going to talk about this thing called the locked-in syndrome, which in many ways has a lot to do with or resembles, at least to an kind of outside observer, a coma, but has some really, really important differences. In brief, someone who has locked-in syndrome is still aware of what's happening largely, but they have a greatly reduced ability to sort of interact with the environment. They don't have sort of motor control for the most part, for example. They can't speak to you or raise their hand, but they're still aware of what's happening. But they sort of present as someone in a vegetative state. So one of the real challenges is how do we distinguish between someone who may be aware of what's happening but not responsive versus someone who's non-responsive and truly unaware of what's happening. And this gives you a bit of a preview of physiologically what tends to happen. We're not really going to focus on a minimally conscious state. We could think of that as maybe when you drift off to sleep. But if you contrast, for example, a fully conscious state with a vegetative state, as you might expect, there's a big difference in overall brain activity. Sort of the metabolic baseline changes quite a bit. So starting with a coma, what is going on with someone who is in what we would call a coma? So comas have a lot to do usually with damage to the brain stem. So the brain stem can be injured in lots of different ways, just like, really virtually any brain region can sustain an injury in any number of ways. You can have, a bacterial or a viral infection. You can have issue with blood supply, something like a stroke. You can have, you can fall off You can be in a motor accident, a car accident. There are lots of ways that you can damage your brainstem. And one of the sort of, in many ways, key part of your brainstem that's relevant for this discussion is the reticular formation, or we can refer to in this lecture as the ascending reticular activating system. So one of the important kind of features or functions of this ascending reticular activating system is there are nuclei there that send signals that are involved with the release of acetylcholine and glutamate. So probably don't have to remind you guys this in a third year course, but glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is involved with things like motor movement and memory. So one of the things that's going to happen is the pons in the brainstem, which is part of this reticular activating system, is going to basically induce the release of acetylcholine or glutamate in the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus is like the sensory switchboard. Signals from your eyes and your ears, the various other parts of your body are being routed through the thalamus to your cortex. So if you're activating kind of the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in this region, that's sort of like the gatekeeper to your consciousness, it makes some sense, perhaps just on the basis of that when those signals are being sent, you would be sort of broadly speaking awake and alert. You would have sort of a heightened state of physiological arousal. And then sort of the counterpoint to that, and this happens, for example, when we're sleeping, we don't have to only talk about the role of this region in mediating consciousness in sort of clinical populations. In sort of the normal, everyday, typical population, we see that there's this kind of ebb and flow, this give and take between sleep and wakefulness, such that when you are awake, when you're sort of in your day, or your waking day, whenever that happens to be for you, you're going to have this acetylcholine and glutamate kind of injection in your thalamus that's going to keep you stimulated. And we have what we can refer to as an antagonist relationship between that activity and activity of neurons in the hypothalamus and the basal forebrain that are going to be inducing GABA release. So remember, GABA is your primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. So, we're really painting this in kind of broad strokes. It's really a bit of a generalization at this point, but you can understand a little bit during sleep of this swing between kind of an alert and a unconscious state that happens relating to this antagonist relationship. And then again, bringing it back to comas specifically, this little bit about the antagonist relationship isn't relevant directly for comas. But if you damage this part of your brain that is kind of sending these, what we could think of as these activating signals, these kind of wake up alert signals, if that's no longer happening, on the surface of it, at least, it makes some sense that in that situation, someone will not be awake and alert and maybe not have awareness of what's happening around them. So for this kind of vegetative or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome or coma, as I said, we're thinking about all these things as being sort of thrown together. One of the kind of tricky things to deal with this is people will often have, at least in a vegetative state, they will look sort of at first glance like they're awake because their eyes are open, and they will seem somewhat lucid. And so this is, of course, misleading for a lot of these individuals. They seem to have no real awareness of what's happening around them, even if they, for example, have their eyes open. So this is sort of not only an empirical problem, not only from a theoretical perspective for people who want to understand consciousness, not only is this a challenge, but in a very real clinical sense for quality of life, this is a big issue. How do we know if someone is in a coma versus in this locked-in state that we're going to talk about? So you can use various kind of diagnostic criteria. This is not sort of an exhaustive list, but we've got a few kinds of things that people look for to try to diagnose someone as being either in a coma or a vegetative state. So, we can think of this a little bit like a continuum, and there are a few things that are happening in a vegetative state that are a little bit different than when you're in a coma, right? Your eyes are not going to be open typically if you're in a coma. They are in a vegetative state. In some sense, we could sort of describe someone in a vegetative state as being slightly less far gone than someone in a coma. But in most cases, they don't seem to have, even if there might be other measurements we could take that look a little bit different, they do not seem to have any kind of sort of genuine lucid sense of consciousness whatsoever. So generally, the diagnostic criteria involve sort of an absence of things that you would typically look for. Like they're not responding to stimuli in the environment, for example. They're not following things with their eyes. They're not making intentional movements, motor movements that seem to be purposeful, like reaching for a glass that you're trying to grab. And as you saw on that initial slide that showed you this kind of gradient of activity, looking from sort of a really inactive brain all the way up to an active brain, one of the big things that you see is the sort of just baseline activity in the brain drops considerably. It's actually, when we talk about the sort of brain metabolic activity dropping to about half of the typical baseline, this actually looks very similar to neurologically or at least in terms of sort of the overall brain activity, starts to actually look quite similar to the brain during non-REM sleep, as well as under anesthesia, a sufficient amount of anesthesia, like general anesthesia, general anesthesia. And that hints at a little bit that if we want to understand what's happening in the brain of someone who is in a coma or a vegetative state, perhaps we could, in some ways, for some of these questions, consider what's happening in the brain during non-REM sleep and or during general anesthesia as being sort of like a model to understand what's happening, at least in some respects, during a coma or a vegetative state. So people who are in comas do sometimes recover on their own, just sort of more or less spontaneously. We know that the brain is very plastic in various ways, so this is maybe not a huge surprise. We can see recovery from brain function, from damage to the brain in various kinds of contexts. This is not, super scientific by any means. This is taken from the Daily Mail, which is generally considered to be, I think, not the most reputable newspaper. So this is just kind of a light, sort of quote unquote fun infographic to get you thinking about the fact that there are various kinds of interventions that people have tried to try to expedite the recovery period after a coma. So you can just leave someone alone, basically, and make sure they're cared for, make sure they're being hydrated and whatnot. But they might just kind of eventually wake up on their own. But you can also try to, for example, by sort of artificially stimulating the brainstem, you can try to kind of jumpstart that process a little bit. So this really, as I say, don't worry about studying this in detail. This is just kind of a slide to get you thinking about the fact that there are various kind of interventions you can try in a clinically relevant situation to try to improve the prognosis of a coma patient. But we're not really interested or focused on clinical stuff so much in our class, at least not clinical for the sake of treating patients. We talk a lot about case studies in the interest of furthering basic research. But I think it's useful to think about the fact that we can try to intervene in what might be a more or less natural recovery process in various kinds of ways. And I guess the last thing to mention before moving on, and we're not talking about this in our class, but you may be familiar with the idea of implanting electrodes that deliver mild electrical current to areas of the brain that may be sort of underperforming, quote unquote, when we're when for various populations. So for example, if you have someone who is dealing with Parkinson's disease and their brain is not producing as much dopamine as they used to, there are various kinds of approaches to trying to treat that. But one thing that you can try to do is implant an electrode that is going to stimulate regions of the brain